My name is Margaret Harlow, and the last thing I remember before the world turned to water was my own son's voice saying, "I just wanted to help you be braver, Mom." Then nothing but the sky, the screaming wind, and the sickening rush of air as I fell. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. The sea swallowed me whole. It was cold in a way that pierced bone, the kind of cold that made your ribs lock up before you could even remember to breathe. My heart, already fragile from years of medication and cautious living, thumped wildly, then skipped a beat. My hands flailed for something solid, but there was nothing but black-green water and the burn in my lungs. I didn't think about bravery. I thought about survival. And about Ethan, my only son, standing on the cliff above me looking down. Was he smiling? I couldn't be sure. I kicked my legs, fighting the heavy pull downward until my head broke the surface. The wind howled, the waves slammed against the jagged rocks nearby, and the salt burned my eyes. I saw no outstretched hand, no rope tossed down, no urgency in his stance. Just a still figure framed against the gray sky. Ethan. I tried to scream, but it came out as a gasp swallowed by the sea. I had maybe seconds before my chest gave in. People assume near-death moments are slow, poetic, almost peaceful. Mine was frantic, jagged. My mind flicked through a million tiny things, my will the unfinished knitting project on the couch, the way Ethan used to hold my finger when he was a toddler. And then somehow, my palm hit rock. Pain shot up my arm as barnacles sliced into my skin, but I held on. I pulled myself toward the base of the cliff, coughing and shivering, my vision narrowing to a tunnel. I couldn't climb. I couldn't shout. All I could do was cling there like some desperate, half-drowned creature. Above me, Ethan turned away. It was nearly half an hour before I was found by strangers, not by him. A couple hiking the trail saw me clinging to the rocks, called for help, and managed to pull me to a safer ledge. The woman kept saying, "You're so lucky." I wanted to laugh. Lucky, I felt like my heart had cracked open in more ways than one. The paramedics strapped me into a stretcher, and I remember asking, "Did you see my son?" They exchanged a look. The man said, "No, ma'am. There was no one up there when we arrived." The hospital smelled like antiseptic and rain-soaked clothing. Nurses fussed over my vitals, muttering about my heart rate while I lay staring at the ceiling tiles. Every instinct in me screamed to call him, demand answers, hear him deny it, and call me dramatic. But another part of me, the part that had been quietly observing Ethan for the last few years, told me to wait. To not rush into a confrontation that he could twist in his favor. When the doctor asked if I had fallen, I paused before nodding. Yes, I fell. My voice didn't even tremble. Inside, I was already building a different kind of plan. Lying in that hospital bed, I remembered a day 25 years ago when Ethan was 8. He had been angry that I wouldn't let him go to a friend's house unsupervised, so he locked me out of the house for almost 2 hours. Back then, I told myself it was childish rebellion. Kids do strange things. But I also remembered his eyes, calm, assessing, as if he enjoyed watching me beg at the door. That same look had been in his eyes on the cliff. When they discharged me 2 days later, I told the nurses my son would be picking me up. He didn't. I went home by taxi, clutching my discharge papers and a quiet storm inside me. The moment I stepped into my house, I noticed at Ethan's coat hanging neatly by the door, his shoes lined up. He'd been here. On the kitchen counter sat a note in his handwriting. "You were amazing today, Mom. Now you know you can face your fears. Lovey." No apology, no mention of my heart, no acknowledgement that he'd left me in the water like a discarded piece of trash. I stood there holding that note and realized something chilling. This wasn't a moment of thoughtless recklessness. It was deliberate. And if it was deliberate, there had to be a reason. I made myself tea, sat down at the table, and stared out the window at the autumn rain. Somewhere out there, my son believed he had the upper hand, that I was too weak, too naive, or too blinded by maternal love to see what he'd done. I smiled. If Ethan thought that he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. I woke the next morning with the sound of rain still tapping against the window. My body ached in ways I hadn't felt since my heart surgery muscles stiff chest tight and a dull throb in my left arm where the barnacles had torn the skin. But it wasn't the pain that kept me lying there. It was the question. Why? Why would my son, my Ethan, push me off that cliff? Ethan had been my whole world from the moment he was born. I was 38 when I had him, older than most new mothers in our small town. My husband Daniel had walked out when Ethan was 6 months old, leaving me to raise him alone. I didn't have much, just a modest teaching salary, a small house, and an endless supply of stubborn determination. I poured everything into him. Nights spent grading papers with him curled up on my lap. Saturdays at the public library letting him stack books higher than his head. I skipped vacations, wore the same winter coat for 5 years, and said no to every dating offer because I didn't want anyone to distract me from raising a good man. And for a long time, I believed I had. Ethan was smart, too smart sometimes. He learned early how to read people, how to charm adults into thinking he was special, how to get away with things by twisting the story just enough to seem believable. Teachers adored him, neighbors praised him, and even when he made mistakes, there was always some excuse that kept him blameless. I brushed off the little warning signs, the way he'd borrow money from my purse without asking, how he'd lie about finishing his homework but still manage to talk his way into extra credit, how he'd look me dead in the eye and deny something even when the evidence was right in front of us both. I told myself it was normal teenage behavior. I told myself I was lucky, at least he wasn't getting into fights, doing drugs, or disappearing for days. But there were moments I couldn't quite forget. Like the time he locked me out of the house when he was 8. It was a chilly autumn afternoon, and I had stepped outside to shake the dirt off a rug. I came back to find the door locked, and through the window there was Ethan standing in the hallway holding the key, smiling. I knocked, called out, even threatened to call the police, but he just stood there calm as anything until nearly 2 hours later when he finally let me in. When I asked why he'd done it, he shrugged. I wanted to see what you'd do. I told myself it was childish mischief. But the truth was, I had felt unsettled by the calm in his voice. Over the years, those moments became easier to ignore. Ethan grew into a handsome, ambitious man. He got a good job in tech, bought expensive suits, and drove a car that cost more than my house was worth. Whenever he visited, neighbors would peek out their windows to watch him arrive. And yet, I saw the shift. His visits became shorter. Phone calls turned into quick check-ins. He stopped asking for my advice. More and more, I was just someone he updated, not someone he confided in. The last year had been the hardest. I'd been diagnosed with atrial fibrillation and, though medication helped, I tired easily. My cardiologist told me to avoid stress and sudden shocks to keep my life calm. I mentioned this to Ethan one afternoon over lunch, and he'd waved it off with a grin. "Mom, you're tougher than you think. You baby yourself too much." I should have seen it coming the moment on that cliff. As I sat at my kitchen table now, his note still lying on the counter, I thought back to the days before the bonding trip he'd invited me on. We hadn't spent real time together in months. Out of the blue, he'd called me Mom. "We should go somewhere. Just you and me. I've been thinking, you've been too cooped up. Let's do something adventurous." Adventurous. The word had made my heart skip for reasons I couldn't name. I'd tried to laugh it off, suggest something simple like a drive to the botanical gardens. But Ethan had insisted on the coast. "There's this cliffside walk, stunning views, fresh air, you'll love it." And I'd said yes because a part of me still wanted to believe he cared. Now the memory of him standing on that cliff, his eyes focused on mine, His hands steady on my shoulders played over and over in my head. I thought of the push, the deliberate pressure, not a stumble or accident. The split second where I realized I was falling and saw his face calm as ever. By late afternoon, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him right away. I wanted answers, but I needed the truth to come from him without him knowing what I knew. Because if Ethan had done this to me on purpose, then the cliff wasn't the only danger ahead. That night, I called him. My voice was light warm. Ethan, thank you for the trip. I'm sore, but I suppose you were right. I survived it. He laughed. See, I told you. You just needed a push. A push. He said it so casually as if he'd help me up a staircase instead of throwing me into the sea. I'll always remember it, I told him. And I meant it. Just not the way he thought. Ethan had always been a master of presentation. If you didn't know him deeply, and maybe even if you did, you'd swear he was the ideal son, the kind of man who sent flowers on Mother's Day, helped old ladies with their groceries, and always knew the right thing to say at a dinner table. From the outside, our family life looked like something out of a Hallmark movie. I was the devoted single mother, he was the successful, charming son, and together, we were an image of resilience and love. But perfect pictures are the easiest to fake. The illusion began to take real shape about 5 years ago when Ethan got his big promotion. He'd thrown a party in his sleek apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a bar stocked with top-shelf liquor and a guest list full of people I didn't know. That night, he introduced me to his colleagues like I was an accessory, a prop, to prove his humble beginnings. "This is my mom, Margaret," he'd said, draping an arm around me. "Raised me all on her own. She's the reason I'm standing here today." I remember smiling and shaking hands, hearing people murmur about how inspiring our story was. But later that night, when I knocked over a glass by accident, I caught the flash of irritation in his eyes, a quick, sharp look before the charm returned. Then came Olivia. She was stunning with the kind of beauty that made people stare, dark hair, green eyes, a figure that looked sculpted. Ethan met her through work, and within months they were inseparable. She moved into his apartment, and together they started curating an image of a power couple on social media. Lavish dinners, beach vacations, charity galas. I liked Olivia at first. She had a warm laugh and called me Mom from the second time we met. But there was something about the way she looked at Ethan, like she was always gauging his reaction, adjusting herself to match what he wanted. I'd seen that look before. On myself. Over the past year, their visits to my house had grown rare, and when they did come, it was usually to announce something: Ethan's new client, Olivia's charity event, their plans for the next big trip. And always, there were the subtle digs. "Mom, you should think about downsizing. This house must be too much for you now. Are you sure you can manage your medication schedule without help? You really shouldn't be driving so much at your age." Each comment was coded in faux concern, but I knew what they really meant. "You're slowing down. You're becoming less useful." The cracks in our bond widened during last Thanksgiving. I'd invited them for dinner, spent 2 days cooking, even splurged on a bottle of wine Ethan liked. They arrived late, almost 2 hours, and Ethan didn't apologize. He just said traffic was bad and sat down like he owned the place. Throughout the meal, he dominated the conversation, telling stories about his career and travels, barely letting me finish a sentence. When I tried to share a memory about him as a boy, he cut me off with a laugh. "Let's not embarrass me in front of Olivia, okay?" It was a joke, but his tone wasn't. That night after they left, I stood in my quiet kitchen staring at the half-empty pie and cold turkey. I'd felt something shift inside me, a quiet recognition that whatever bond we'd once had was changing into something transactional. And in the weeks that followed, I started noticing small details. Ethan had stopped calling me unless he needed something: money, a favor, or a connection to someone in my old teaching network. He'd begun making comments about my finances, casually asking about my retirement account. One afternoon, while I was washing dishes, I overheard a voicemail he'd accidentally left while his phone was still in his pocket. I could hear his voice talking to Olivia, saying, "Mom's just sitting on money she's not even using. We could." Then the sound muffled as if he'd covered the phone. I deleted the message, but the words stayed. So when Ethan invited me on that bonding trip to the coast, a part of me had already been uneasy. I told myself it would be a chance to reconnect, to remind him of who we used to be. But another part of me, the quiet, cautious part, wondered if it was something else. After the cliff, that wondering turned into certainty. It's funny the way betrayal works. You don't want to believe it's real. Your mind tries to find softer explanations. Maybe it was a prank gone wrong. Maybe he panicked and didn't know how to help. Maybe he thought I could swim better than I could. But then, you look at the history, the patterns, and you realize the cliff was just the most dramatic move in a long game. And I had to decide whether to keep playing along or change the rules. The next time I saw Ethan after the fall, he was all smiles. We met at a coffee shop and he hugged me like nothing had happened. "You're looking great, Mom. See, that trip was good for you." I smiled back, hiding the storm in my chest. "Maybe you're right," I said. "Maybe I needed that push." And as I stirred my coffee, I thought, "You have no idea, Ethan. But you will." Some betrayals announce themselves with a bang. Others arrive like a slow leak, so quiet you barely notice until the floor beneath you is warped and rotting. With Ethan, it was both. The cliff was the bang. Everything else had been leaking for years. A week after our coffee meeting, he came over to check on me. That's how he put it. But I quickly realized it wasn't about me at all. He strode through my front door without knocking, holding his phone like a compass. "Olivia's looking at rental listings for you," he said before I could even greet him. "Something smaller, more manageable. Less risky." I frowned. "Risky, Mom, you're alone here. Stairs a big yard, too much upkeep. What if you fall again?" The way he said again sent a shiver down my spine. It was a reminder, subtle, sharp, that he hadn't forgotten the cliff. Neither had I. That afternoon, while I made tea, he wandered the house, opening drawers, glancing at shelves. It felt like he was cataloging my life. When we sat down, he reached across the table and took my hand. To anyone watching, it would have looked like affection. To me, it felt like possession. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about the future. You should put the house in my name now while you're healthy. That way, if anything happens, it's all squared away." I stared at him, my hand still trapped under his. "And what if I don't want to?" He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've always trusted me, right?" It wasn't just the property. Over the next few visits, there were other moments, small humiliations, little cuts. When Olivia joined him for dinner one night, she brought a bottle of wine and said sweetly, "Don't worry, Mrs. Harlow, this one's light. Perfect for someone your age." Ethan laughed, adding, "Yeah, we wouldn't want you passing out on us again." I kept my face still, but inside, I filed it away. Again. That word, again. The worst was at a family gathering for my sister's birthday. The living room was full of relatives, laughter, and music. I was telling a story about my teaching days when Ethan interrupted, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Careful, Mom, don't get too excited. We don't want your heart giving out." It was meant to be a joke, but it landed like a stone in the room. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Others looked at me with pity. My cheeks burned. I excused myself to the kitchen, breathing slowly to keep the tears at bay. Through the doorway, I could hear Ethan charming the room again, spinning the moment into light banter while my humiliation hung in the air like smoke. That was the moment I knew I couldn't simply wait for the truth to emerge. I would have to pull it into the light myself. I began watching him more closely, noting the way he'd check his phone during our conversations, the way Olivia's eyes would flick toward him before she spoke, as if for silent approval. I noticed how he seemed more interested in my financial health than my physical one. He asked about my life insurance policy twice in the same week, brushing it off as just being responsible. And every time I smiled and gave him just enough to think I was still the trusting mother he believed I was. Inside, I was sketching out a plan. It wasn't fully formed yet, more instinct than strategy, but it began with one simple rule: Ethan could never know I suspected him. I started keeping a small notebook in my nightstand, jotting down every comment, every odd request, every slip of the mask. Decker 3. Asked again about selling the house. Mentioned less stress for me, but didn't look at me when he said it. Decartron 10. Olivia suggested putting me on a stricter budget for my own good. Ethan nodded along. Dec 22. Ethan joked about my cliff dive in front of Olivia's friends. They laughed. My hands shook, but I smiled. It was amazing how quickly the pages filled. The first turning point came one Sunday afternoon. I'd been pruning the rose bushes when I heard voices through the open kitchen window, Ethan and Olivia talking in the driveway before coming in. "She's too trusting," Olivia said. "We could have it all set up before she even realizes." Ethan's voice low but clear. "That's the plan." I stood frozen, pruning shears in hand, the smell of cut roses in the air. I didn't hear the rest. I didn't need to. It wasn't just paranoia. It was real. And if they thought I was too trusting to notice, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. When they came inside, I greeted them warmly, pouring tea and asking about their week as though nothing had happened, because the game had shifted. Now I wasn't just the mother they were underestimating. I was the opponent they didn't see coming. Looking back, I realized the bonding trip to the coast had been his opening move. At the time, I'd thought it was spontaneous, maybe even an olive branch, but now I could see how calculated it was. It hadn't been about cliffs or bravery. It had been about control. The memory of that phone call felt sharper now, every detail standing out. Mom, Ethan had said, his voice warm and casual. "We never do anything adventurous anymore. I found this amazing spot on the coast. Great views, fresh air. Just you and me." I remember hesitating, telling him my doctor had advised against too much physical exertion. "That's the point," he'd replied. "You've been living too carefully. You'll love it." There was something in his tone, insistent, just shy of pressuring, that made me agree, even though my instincts whispered against it. Now, with my suspicion fully awake, I began dissecting every moment of that trip. The way he'd taken the scenic route, avoiding towns as if he didn't want us to be seen together that day. The way he'd parked far from the cliff, making me walk a long path despite my shortness of breath. The way he'd stood behind me, talking about fear and courage as though rehearsing a speech. And of course, the push. The week after overhearing Ethan and Olivia in the driveway, I decided to get answers quietly. I started with my will. I dug it out of the locked cabinet in my bedroom, dusted off the envelope, and read through it line by line. Ethan was listed as the sole beneficiary of the house, my savings, and my life insurance. That meant if I died suddenly, everything would go to him without question. I put the will back, but I didn't lock it. I wanted to see if it would be disturbed. In the meantime, I played the part of the grateful, slightly fragile mother. I called him more often, asked him to help with small errands, invited him for meals. Each time I watched, and he grew bolder. One evening after dinner, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, Mom, you should really think about updating your will, just to make things simpler." Why, I asked lightly. "It already leaves everything to you." He shrugged. "Laws change. Plus, Olivia and we've been talking about starting a family. We'd want to make sure things are secure for them." I smiled as if touched. "Of course, I'll look into it." Inside, my stomach turned. 2 days later, while he thought I was napping, I heard the creak of my bedroom door. I stayed still, breathing slow, listening to his footsteps cross the floor. There was the sound of the cabinet door opening, then the faint slide of paper against paper. A pause, then the sound of the door closing again. He didn't know I'd moved the will to a different folder. The one he took out was blank paper. When he left that evening, I checked. The stack had been disturbed. It was almost too easy to let him believe I was still oblivious. By the end of the month, I had an appointment with a lawyer, someone I'd taught in high school years ago, a sharp, trustworthy woman named Dana. I told her everything from the cliff to the driveway conversation. Her face hardened. "You need to protect yourself. Immediately." We drafted a new will, one that left the bulk of my assets to a trust managed by my niece with a clear clause. If my death was deemed suspicious, Ethan would be automatically disinherited. Dana also suggested I document everything. "If you ever need proof of intent," she said, "dates and details will be your best friend." I'd already started that. The next step was harder, gathering evidence without tipping him off. That meant inviting him into my life more often, pretending to lean on him. I asked for help with grocery runs, small home repairs, anything that made him feel in control, because the more comfortable he felt, the more careless he'd become. One Saturday, I asked him to drive me to the pharmacy. On the way back, he said, "You know, Mom, if you moved in with us, you wouldn't have to worry about any of this. We could handle everything for you." "Tempting," I said, glancing at him, "but I like my independence." He laughed. "Yeah, but independence can be dangerous." I smiled. "So can dependence." For the first time, I saw a flicker in his expression, something wary, like he'd caught the edge of a blade, but wasn't sure where it had come from. That was when I knew the tide was starting to turn. He thought I was standing on the same cliff waiting for the next push, but I was already building my own ground beneath me. I hadn't thought about the cliff in weeks, at least, not the way I did that night. It was one of those sleepless evenings where the silence in the house felt heavy, almost pressing. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea, and for the first time I forced myself to replay that trip in its entirety. Not just the moments I remembered fondly, all of it. It was a bright, wind-cut morning when we'd arrived at the coast. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a single dusty sedan. Ethan had insisted we leave our phones in the glove compartment. "No distractions, Mom. Just nature and us." I'd thought it was sweet then, a son wanting his mother's undivided attention. Now that detail lodged in my throat. No phones meant no quick calls for help, no GPS tracking, no photos with timestamps. The path to the cliff was longer than I'd expected. It wound through low scrub and uneven ground, the sea always just out of sight until the last sharp bend. "Take your time," Ethan had said, though his stride never slowed. I'd hurried to keep up my chest tight, my cane sinking into the sandy soil. I remember him glancing back, not with concern, but with something else I couldn't name then. Now I knew: calculation. The moment we reached the edge, the wind roared up from the sea. My cardigan snapped against my sides, and the smell of salt was sharp in my lungs. "It's beautiful," I'd said. And it was wild and endless, the kind of beauty that made you feel small. "Step closer," he urged, pointing toward a narrow patch of grass right before the drop. "The view's even better." I hesitated. My feet were inches from the edge already. "I can see fine from here." He smiled tight, almost coaxing. "Don't be afraid. You've got to live a little, Mom." I'd stepped forward. It was instinct, not trust. Instinct to please him, to keep the moment smooth. He moved behind me close enough that I could feel the warmth of him through my sweater. And then, a push. Small, quick. Not enough to send me over, but enough that my shoe slipped on loose earth. My cane jabbed into the dirt and I lurched forward, heart thudding in my ears. I caught myself, but barely. "Careful," he'd said, steadying me. His tone was light, teasing. "You've got to watch your footing." I'd laughed nervously, blaming the wind, my age, the ground, anything but him. But now, months later, in the silence of my kitchen, I could feel that nudge again. It had been deliberate, measured. A test. I got up and fetched my leather-bound notebook, the one Dana told me to keep. On a fresh page, I wrote Cliff, March 14th. He chose remote location, left phones in car, made me walk farther than necessary, positioned himself behind me, push-controlled testing reaction, immediate deflection, blamed footing. My response compliant, non-accusatory. Seeing it in ink made my skin crawl. It also made me feel strangely steady. If he'd done that once, he could do it again. And if he could do it again, I could be ready. The next morning, I called Ethan. My voice was warm, almost playful. "I've been thinking about that trip," I said. "We should do something like that again, before the weather turns." There was a pause, then a spark of interest in his tone. "Really, I know a place even better than the cliff." "I'll leave it in your hands," I told him, because this time, it would be. But not in the way he thought. When Ethan offered to handle everything for our second outing, I pretended to be relieved. "Good," I told him. "You always pick such nice places." It was a strange thing lying so easily to my own child. But then again, Ethan hadn't really been my own child for some time now. Not the boy I raised, at least. The man on the other end of the phone was someone I didn't recognize. Someone who had once looked me in the eye on a cliff and decided I was expendable. Over the next week, I noticed something. He became lighter, happier. As if this upcoming trip was more exciting than he wanted to admit. He even dropped by unannounced with a bag of groceries, something he hadn't done since before my husband died. "You've been looking thin," he said, unpacking the bags with that boyish grin he could still conjure on command. It almost fooled me. Almost. While he made small talk in my kitchen, I took note of the details. He had a new pair of hiking boots, a rolled-up map sticking out of his backpack, and a small coiled rope, thin, strong, the kind climbers used. When I asked about the rope, he shrugged. "Just in case the trail's slippery. Safety first." It was said so casually that someone else might have believed him. But not me. Not anymore. That night, I called Dana. "He's planning something," I told her. She didn't argue. "Then so are you." Her words weren't a question. So I began my own preparations. I went to the hardware store and bought a small, discreet body camera, the kind that clipped inside a jacket. I tested it in my living room, adjusting the angle until it caught my hands and everything in front of me. I also bought something else, a collapsible trekking pole sturdier than my cane with a steel tip sharp enough to bite into rock. And tucked at the bottom of my handbag, I placed an emergency flare. Not because I thought Ethan would help me if something went wrong, but because I knew someone else might see it. The morning of the trip, Ethan arrived early. He was dressed in layers, his backpack bulging, his mood almost giddy. "Ready for an adventure, Mom?" he asked, taking my bag before I could answer. "Always," I smiled. The drive was long, winding through back roads and dense woods. My stomach knotted tighter with each mile, but outwardly, I stayed calm. We made small talk about weather, neighbors, meaningless things. He seemed relaxed, but every so often his hand would tap the steering wheel in a restless rhythm. When I asked how far we were going, he said, "Not too far. Just private. Private." That word lodged in my chest. Finally, we pulled into a gravel turnout. No signs, no other cars. Just a narrow trail disappearing into the trees. "After you," he said, swinging his pack over one shoulder. I adjusted the hidden camera, tucked the trekking pole under my arm, and stepped onto the path. The forest was quiet except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. He walked close behind, sometimes too close, the rope in his pack shifting with each step. I didn't hurry. Let him think I was slow, fragile, unaware. But in my mind, I counted every turn, every rise in the ground, every place where the trees thinned. If this was going to be the spot, I would know it before he did. Half an hour in, the trail opened to a rocky ridge, below a sheer drop into a ravine. The wind was calmer than it had been on the cliff months ago, but the air was still sharp. "This is it," Ethan said. "Worth the walk, huh?" I looked out at the view, green giving way to silver water far below, and said, "Beautiful." Inside, I braced myself, because I knew this was where he would try again. And this time, he wasn't the only one ready. Ethan dropped his backpack on a flat slab of rock, unzipped it, and pulled out a water bottle. "Thirsty?" he asked, offering it to me. The bottle was clean, clear, ordinary looking, too ordinary. My fingers didn't even twitch toward it. "I'm fine," I said, settling onto a nearby boulder. I leaned on my trekking pole as if for balance, my jacket rustling just enough to remind me the body camera was recording. The view was breathtaking. Not in a postcard way, but in a way that told you this place wasn't meant for people. Below the ridge, jagged rocks poked from the ravine like the teeth of something waiting. Ethan stood close to the edge, his hands resting casually in his pockets. He looked down for a long moment, then back at me. "You ever think about endings?" he asked, voice light, almost musing, the kind of question someone might ask in a philosophy class, or on a day when they're thinking about making yours come early. I tilted my head. "What kind of endings? Just when people decide they're done? Or when someone decides for them?" He smiled like it was a joke. It wasn't. The rope appeared from his backpack a moment later. He unraveled it, slowly looping it around his hand, testing its give. "I thought we could get a better angle," he said, nodding toward the ledge. "I'll go first, you follow. I can help you down." Help me down. The same way someone might help a stray dog across a busy road quickly, permanently. I shifted my weight forward as if preparing to stand, but kept my grip on the trekking pole. "I think I'll stay up here," I said softly. His smile faltered. "You sure you don't want to see the view from there? I see enough from here." I said, my eyes steady on his. For a moment, something ugly flickered in his expression, frustration, maybe even calculation. Then he crouched beside me, setting the rope aside. "You don't trust me, do you?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a probe. "I want to," I said. "But you make it hard." The air between us tightened. The only sound was the wind brushing through the trees. Then he reached for my arm. I moved before he could tighten his grip, just a subtle shift, using the trekking pole to lever myself up and back a step. "Careful," I said. "You don't want me to slip." The way his jaw clenched told me he understood exactly what I'd done. We stood there staring at each other, neither moving. Then he laughed. Not warmly, more like he'd just lost a hand of cards and was pretending it didn't matter. "All right, Mom," he said, slinging the rope back into his bag. "Guess you win this round." Round. So he thought there would be more. As we walked back down the trail, I kept my pace steady, the camera still rolling, because I knew something now, something important. He wasn't going to stop. Not until one of us was gone. And I had no intention of letting it be me. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, fear had burned itself out hours ago, but because my mind wouldn't stop moving. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan standing on that ridge, rope in hand, his eyes measuring the distance between my body and the rocks below. By 3 a.m., I had brewed a second pot of coffee and was sitting at my dining table with my laptop open. The body camera lay beside me, its tiny green light still glowing faintly from charging. I plugged it in and copied the footage to a password-protected folder on a flash drive. Then another. And another. 3 copies, one to hide in my sewing box, one to drop in the safe deposit box at the bank, and one to mail to my old friend Denise in Oregon. The footage wasn't damning in a courtroom sense. Ethan hadn't said, "I'm going to kill you," but it was off. His tone, his rope, the way he'd spoken about endings, and that flash of frustration when I refused to go near the ledge, it was all there. I didn't need this to convince a jury yet. I needed it to convince people who mattered, people who might step in, or at least start looking at him differently. First on my list was my daughter Claire. She'd always been the rational one between her and Ethan, but she also had a dangerous blind spot when it came to family loyalty. I called her after breakfast. She answered on the second ring, her voice still thick with sleep. "Mom, everything okay? I just wanted to share something with you," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Do you have your laptop open?" She hesitated. "Why? What's going on? I'll explain after you watch this." It took a full minute for the file to upload. While it did, I kept my breathing slow, my eyes on the mug of coffee in front of me. When the ping came through on her end, she didn't even say goodbye, just clicked the link. The silence on the other end stretched. Then Mom. This is what is this? What was he doing? I don't know. I lied. I just know I didn't feel safe. And I think you need to know too. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then softly, I'll talk to him. No, I said sharply. Don't. Not yet. Let him think nothing's changed. Why? Because I want to see what he does when he thinks no one's watching. That was step one. Step two meant calling Denise. She wasn't just an old friend, she'd been a county prosecutor before she retired, and she still had friends in the legal system. When I told her I'd mailed her something, she didn't ask questions. She just said, I'll watch it and I'll call you. The rest of the day, I went about my routine as if nothing had happened. I weeded the garden, went to the library, baked a pie. Ethan had taught me something important up on that ridge. Patience wasn't passive. It was the quiet gathering of momentum. That night around 9 p.m. he called. Hey, Mom, he said, his voice casual but tight around the edges. Had a good time hiking yesterday. I smiled into the phone. Me too. We talked about nothing, the weather, his job, whether I'd seen the new diner on Main Street. But under his words, I could hear the testing in his tone. He wanted to know if I suspected anything. When we hung up, I knew two things. One, he wasn't done. Two, he didn't realize I was 2 steps ahead of him now. The next day, I visited the local hardware store. I bought new locks for the doors, security cameras for the outside, and most importantly, a GPS tracker small enough to slip into the lining of Ethan's car seat. The clerk raised an eyebrow at my purchase. Big security upgrade, huh? Something like that, I said with a smile. Installing the cameras was easy. Installing the tracker would take more finesse. I didn't have to wait long for the opportunity. 2 days later, Ethan stopped by unannounced carrying a bag of groceries. Thought you might want some company for lunch, he said. I let him in, keeping my smile polite. While he unpacked the groceries in my kitchen, I stepped out to check the mail slipped to his car and pressed the tracker deep into the seam of the seat. 10 seconds, maybe less. Over the next week, the pattern emerged. He was visiting places that made no sense: an abandoned cabin outside town, a pawn shop near the highway, and once, disturbingly, the same cliff we'd hiked to, even though he was alone. I sent the GPS logs to Denise. Her reply came back in under an hour. Keep gathering. You're building a pattern. I didn't confront Ethan. I didn't warn him. I just watched. And waited. Because patience wasn't just my shield, it was my weapon. But I also knew the danger was climbing. Every day he didn't succeed was a day he might get bolder. So I began step 3, creating a witness network. I invited my neighbor Carl over for coffee twice a week. He was retired military, the kind of man who noticed things without having to be told what to look for. I just happened to mention that Ethan had been acting strangely. Carl nodded slowly. I'll keep an eye out. 2 weeks into my quiet campaign, Ethan called again. This time, there was a new note in his voice. Eagerness. Hey, Mom, I found this great spot for fishing. Way out by the old quarry. Nobody goes there anymore. Thought we could make a day of it. The quarry. Another place where a fall could be written off as an accident. I agreed instantly. Sounds lovely. Because now I didn't just have my camera. I had eyes watching from a distance, GPS logs, and a friend in law enforcement ready to move. If Ethan wanted to set the stage for my ending, I would make sure the curtain rose on his instead. That night, I sat at my table again, my coffee cooling beside me, and looked at the list I'd made: evidence secured. Allies in place. Tracker active. Next meeting arranged. I underlined the last point twice. Because this time, when Ethan made his move, the whole world would see him for what he was. And I'd be the one pulling the rope. The morning of the quarry trip, I woke before sunrise. The air in my house felt still, like the quiet before a storm. I dressed in layered clothing, practical shoes, and my old fishing hat, the same one I wore on trips with my late husband. The body camera was clipped neatly to the inside flap of my jacket, hidden but with a clear view. My phone was fully charged, its recording app primed and ready. I checked my bag twice: snacks, water, a small first aid kit, and tucked at the very bottom a whistle loud enough to pierce the air for a mile. This wasn't a day for fear. It was a day for control. At 8:00 sharp, Ethan pulled into my driveway. His truck was freshly washed, windows rolled down, his smile wide, but not quite reaching his eyes. "Ready for a little adventure, Mom, always," I said, stepping in. The moment I settled into the seat, I felt the tracker under me, the small bump in the fabric no one else would notice. My phone pinged quietly in my pocket, a notification from Denise's friend in the sheriff's department. Signal received. Tracking live. The drive was long, winding through back roads lined with pine and maple. The sun was warm, but the shadows were long in the forest, and the air grew cooler as we approached the quarry. Ethan talked the whole way, stories about work, a half-formed plan for a cabin he wanted to build someday. I let him talk, my responses soft and even, all while my mind measured every pause in his sentences, every glance in the rearview mirror. When we finally reached the dirt road leading to the quarry, his voice grew quieter. "No one comes out here anymore," he said, turning the wheel. "Perfectly peaceful." I smiled faintly. "Perfect for fishing, you mean?" The quarry was vast, its water a deep, impossible blue, framed by jagged rock walls that rose like ancient fortresses. There were no railings here, no warning signs, just a sheer drop from the ledge to the still surface below. Ethan grabbed the fishing poles from the truck bed. "There's a spot over there," he said, nodding toward a narrow trail skirting the cliff's edge. "Best view in the place." I let him lead. Halfway along the trail, I tripped on a root, grabbing his arm for balance. It gave me the perfect chance to glance behind us, just a flicker of movement deep in the trees. Carl was there exactly as planned, his camo jacket blending with the pines. He raised a hand slightly, signaling all clear. I kept walking. When we reached the spot, Ethan set down the poles and stepped closer to the ledge. "See? Isn't it something?" he asked, gesturing at the expanse. I moved to stand beside him, but not too close. The drop was at least 40 feet, enough to ensure there'd be no surviving a fall. "Beautiful," I said. "Almost too perfect." He glanced at me sharply, as if weighing my choice of words. Then it began. The same pattern as the ridge. He spoke softly about how life was unpredictable, how people sometimes just let go when things became too much. He didn't touch me yet, but his presence was deliberate, his stance between me and the safe path back. I let my voice tremble slightly. "Ethan, why are you saying these things?" He gave a small smile. "Just thinking out loud." I knew what was coming, but so did my camera, and so did the man in the trees. When Ethan took a step toward me, the crunch of boots on gravel echoed from behind us. Carl emerged slowly from the path, holding a fishing tackle box. "Thought I'd join you too," he said casually, though his eyes locked with mine for a fraction of a second. Ethan stiffened, masking it with a thin smile. "Didn't know you were coming." "Just happened to be nearby," Carl replied, setting the box down on the ground. "Don't mind me." Ethan's plan had cracked, but I could see the gears still turning in his head. He tried to recover, joking about how clumsy I'd be with the fishing line, handing me one of the poles, as though nothing had happened. But I didn't miss the way he kept glancing at Carl, calculating. We fished for an hour, the silence heavy between us. Carl made easy conversation, but Ethan was quieter than I'd seen him in years. When we finally packed up, Ethan insisted on taking a different way back to the truck, a route that wound past an even narrower ledge. I refused, smiling politely. "I think I'll stick with the trail we came on," I said. "My knees aren't what they used to be." Back at the truck, Ethan drove us home without a word. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. When he pulled into my driveway, I thanked him warmly for the trip. His eyes searched mine, trying to read whether I suspected him. "I'll call you later," he said. I smiled. Of course. The moment his truck disappeared down the road, Carl stepped out from the shadows near my porch. "You got everything he asked?" I held up the flash drive from my pocket, the one that now contained both the ridge footage and the quarry. Everything I said. That night, I uploaded the new video to the same secure folders as before. Denise called an hour later. "This is enough," she said. "Not to convict, but to start an official investigation. The pattern's clear. The intent is there." I exhaled slowly. "So what happens now?" Now she said we wait for him to try again, except this time the net's already in place. It wasn't the answer I wanted. I wanted this over. But Denise was right. Ethan wasn't going to stop because of suspicion. He'd only stop if he believed the walls were closing in. And the next time he made a move, those walls would be real. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the sound of the clock ticking in the background. Ethan thought he was playing a game of patience. But I had learned something he hadn't. Patience isn't waiting for the right moment. It's making the right moment wait for you. 3 days passed before Ethan reached out again. 3 long, deliberate days. In that time, I moved like a woman with nothing to fear. I gardened. I baked. I visited the corner store and chatted with neighbors. But inside, every sense was sharpened, every movement calculated. Denise had told me to keep things normal, but in my heart, I knew Ethan was planning something bigger. The quarry had rattled him, and a man like him didn't let a plan die without birthing another one. When his call finally came, his tone was light. Too light. "Hey, Mom," he said, "how about dinner at my place this Friday? Just the two of us. I'll make your favorite pot roast." I almost laughed. Pot roast was my late husband's dish, the one Ethan used to pick at as a boy, claiming the carrots were mushy. The invitation wasn't about food. Still, I agreed. Sounds wonderful. Friday evening, I dressed simply, slipping the body camera under my cardigan. Carl would be nearby again, parked 2 houses down, engine cold eyes on the driveway. When I arrived, Ethan's house was warm with the smell of beef and onions. The table was set for 2 candles flickering in their holders. "You've gone all out," I said, hanging my coat. "Figured you deserved a nice night," he replied, pulling out my chair. His smile was gentle, but his gaze was locked on me a beat too long. The meal was almost pleasant. We talked about the weather, about the garden, about a neighbor's new fence. But there was a tightness in him, like a bowstring drawn and waiting to snap. Halfway through dessert, a slice of pie I hadn't seen him prepare, he leaned back and sighed. "You know, Mom," he began, "I've been thinking about how hard it must be for you to keep up the house alone. Big place for just one person." I set down my fork. "It's not so bad. But wouldn't it be nice," he continued, "to live somewhere smaller? Closer to me, maybe I could help you sell the house, handle all the paperwork." There it was. Not an accident this time, not a shove from a cliff. This was a slower kind of kill. "You mean, give you power of attorney?" I said evenly. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes did. "It'd make things easier, for both of us." "And what would you do with that power?" "Ethan, take care of you," he said quickly. Too quickly. I leaned forward, my voice soft. "Ethan, you've tried to take care of me before?" His jaw tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means." He stared at me for a long moment, then gave a short laugh. "You've been talking to people. Denise, maybe? Or Carl?" I kept my face neutral. "You're imagining things." He shook his head slowly. "No. You're recording me, aren't you?" For a split second my chest tightened, but I kept my composure. "Ethan, you're my son. Why would I do that?" His eyes swept my cardigan, then my hands. I knew he suspected, but suspicion wasn't proof. And just then, salvation. A knock at the door. Ethan frowned, pushing back his chair. When he opened the door, Carl was standing there with a grocery bag in hand. "Evening," Carl said. "Brought you that coffee you like?" Thought I'd drop it off before it went stale. Ethan glanced back at me, his smile brittle. Kind of you. Carl stepped inside without waiting to be invited, setting the bag on the counter. His eyes met mine briefly, the silent question passing between us. Is it bad? I gave the smallest nod. Ethan excused himself to the kitchen, muttering about reheating coffee. Carl leaned toward me, his voice low. We've got enough from the quarry. If we can get him talking tonight, we end it. I can try, I whispered. When Ethan returned, I was ready. I pushed my plate away, resting my chin in my hand. You know, I said casually, if I were to disappear, I imagine you'd get the house, wouldn't you? He froze mid-step. Why would you say something like that? Just curious. Hypothetically. His mouth twitched. Hypothetically. Yeah, I guess I would. And hypothetically, I continued. Would you push me to sign it over sooner rather than later? Ethan's eyes flickered between me and Carl. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Hypothetically, maybe I would. The room was still. The body camera was running. And for the first time, Ethan realized the game wasn't his anymore. Carl's voice was calm, but it cut like glass. You've said enough, Ethan. Ethan's gaze darkened. What's this, some kind of trap? Carl didn't move. No trap. Just the truth catching up to you. The tension was thick enough to choke on. I could see the rage in Ethan's face, the way his fingers flexed as though resisting an urge. But in the end, he sat down slowly, his fork scraping against the plate. Eat your pie, Mom, he said flatly. I did not touch it. When I left that night, Carl walked me to my car. You'll get a call from Denise tomorrow, he said. We'll move forward. Carefully. But after tonight, he won't see us coming. I looked back at the house. The curtains twitched upstairs. Patience had served me well so far. But I could feel it, the endgame was close. And this time, I wouldn't just survive. I would win. By Saturday morning, Denise had called exactly as Carl promised. Her voice was crisp, each word measured, like she was building a wall around the conversation. We have enough to move, she said. Between the quarry footage and last night's admissions, we can act. But I want you prepared. Ethan's going to know it's over. Prepared. I'd been preparing for months. But there's a difference between readiness in theory and standing at the edge of the storm. I spent the day cleaning the house, my hands scrubbing floors. I didn't really care about my mind tracing every possible move Ethan might make. By late afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, it was him. Mom, he said, his voice almost tender. I've been thinking about our dinner. I feel like we got off on the wrong foot. Did we? I asked. I want to make it up to you. Come by tomorrow morning. I've got something for you. I should have said no. Every instinct told me the gift wasn't for me, it was for the idea of me, the title holder, the final barrier between him and his inheritance. But I also knew the net was nearly closed around him. If tomorrow was the day, then I needed to be there to see it end. I'll be there, I said. Sunday was gray and heavy with the smell of rain. I wore the camera again, this time hidden inside the button placket of my coat. Carl was in position before I even backed out of the driveway. Ethan's house looked ordinary, but when he opened the door, I caught the flicker of something in his eyes, desperation disguised as charm. On the kitchen table was a small velvet-covered box. Go on, he urged. Open it. Inside was a gold bracelet, delicate and old-fashioned. My bracelet. From the jewelry box in my bedroom. You've been in my house, I said quietly. His smile didn't falter. I thought you'd like to wear it again. I set the box down. What do you want, Ethan? He exhaled sharply. I want you to trust me. I want you to stop fighting me on everything. We could make things so much easier if you'd just sign the papers. And if I don't. Something in his face cracked then, just for a moment. His eyes went cold. Then you'll regret it. I didn't flinch. You've already made me regret plenty. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think Carl can protect you forever? You think Denise can stop me? Mom, you're not untouchable. Accidents happen every day. It was the clearest threat yet, and the camera caught every word. Before I could respond, a sharp knock rattled the front door. Ethan glanced toward it, irritation flashing across his features. Carl stepped inside without waiting to be invited, and behind him came Denise, her badge glinting under the kitchen light. Ethan James Moore. Denise said evenly, "You're under arrest for attempted elder abuse conspiracy to commit fraud and reckless endangerment." Ethan laughed too loudly, too forced. "You've got to be kidding me. This is my mother. And she's the one who just helped us make the case," Denise replied. The moment the handcuffs clicked, Ethan's mask shattered. He glared at me with something darker than anger, something closer to hate. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You've humiliated me." "I'll remember this." Denise's voice was steady. "You won't have the chance to act on it." They led him out into the rain, his protests fading into the sound of the car door slamming shut. Carl stayed behind, his gaze softening as he looked at me. "It's done," he said. But I knew better. It wasn't done. Not entirely. Because the wounds Ethan had left weren't just legal. They were carved into trust, into memory, into the quiet places in my heart. That night, the house felt heavier than ever. Safe, yes. But lonely in a way safety couldn't fix. Still, when I sat at the kitchen table and poured myself a cup of tea, I knew one thing for certain: I had survived my son. And survival in my world was its own form of victory. The morning after Ethan's arrest, the sky was clear for the first time in a week. I sat by the window with my tea, watching the dew cling to the grass, and for a moment I could almost believe the world was steady again. But the phone shattered that illusion. It wasn't Carl. It wasn't Denise. It was the county jail. "Mrs. Harlow," the voice said, professional, but tinged with the fatigue of someone who has heard too many pleas in one lifetime, "Your son is requesting to speak with you." "You're not obligated to accept." I hesitated. The rational part of me screamed to hang up, but another part, the one that still remembered his small hand clutching mine at the grocery store, the one that remembered lullabies and scraped knees, couldn't quite let go without hearing him. "I'll take the call," I said. The line clicked, and then his voice filled my ear. "Mom," he said, the word breaking slightly, "you don't understand what you've done." "Oh, I understand," I replied. My voice was steady, but my fingers gripped the phone tight. "I understand perfectly. You tried to take everything from me." "I was trying to save us," he shot back. "You're stuck in that old house, clinging to a past that's dead. I could have turned it into something worth more than your pension will ever give you." I almost laughed, the absurdity of it all threatening to spill over. "You wanted to save us by destroying me." There was silence then, a shift in his tone, softer, almost pleading. "They're talking about pressing more charges, Mom. You could help me? Just tell them you misunderstood. That you were confused." The audacity made my skin crawl. "Confused," I repeated. "You think after everything you've done, I'm going to lie for you?" "You're my mother," he said, like that alone was currency enough to buy my loyalty. "And you stopped being my son the day you decided my worth was measured in square footage and bank accounts," I answered. I hung up before he could say more. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of knowing I had finally closed a door that could never be reopened. The calls didn't stop, though. He tried again 2 days later, and again after that. Each time I refused to answer. By the third attempt, I had the jail block my number from his call list. In the meantime, the news had spread. This town might be small, but gossip here moved faster than wildfire on dry brush. At the grocery store, Mrs. Whitcomb from the church choir caught my arm by the dairy aisle. "Margaret, I heard about Ethan. I just want you to know what you did was brave." At the post office, the clerk leaned forward and whispered, "Heard your boy's in some trouble. You hold your head up now. Not your fault." And yet, for every voice of support, there were whispers I wasn't meant to hear. She turned her own son in, one woman muttered outside the bakery. Blood should be thicker than water, another said. Those words dug at me more than I wanted to admit. Because I knew if I'd grown up watching my own mother betray me, I might have been hardened to this sooner. But I hadn't. My mother had been the kind of woman who would have burned her own hands to keep me warm. The guilt came in waves, always at night when the house was quiet. I would sit at the kitchen table with only the hum of the refrigerator for company and wonder if there was some turning point I had missed, some moment in Ethan's life where I could have chosen differently and steered him away from the man he became. Carl stopped by one evening with a bag of takeout and a bottle of ginger ale. "You're too quiet," he said, setting the food down. "That's when I worry. I'm just thinking," I admitted. "About what?" "Whether I failed him." Carl shook his head immediately. "Maggie listened to me. Ethan made his own choices. He had a good home, a decent upbringing. You gave him more than most parents ever could. What he did wasn't because you failed. It's because he decided he was owed something." I wanted to believe him. I really did. Denise called a few days later with an update. "He's looking at a plea deal," she said. "If he takes it, he could be out in under 3 years. With conditions." Conditions. "No contact with you for starters. We're pushing for that to be ironclad." A strange mix of relief and grief settled in my chest. Relief because I knew he wouldn't be able to walk up to my door one day with another scheme. Grief because it meant that the thin thread connecting us would be severed for good. Weeks passed. Life began to settle into a rhythm again. The garden needed tending. The fence out back needed a new coat of paint. And in the evenings I began to read again. Not the quick paperbacks I'd used to pass the time, but the heavy old novels I'd always meant to revisit. The quiet was different now. Less oppressive. More intentional. But one afternoon, as I was pulling weeds near the back fence, I noticed an envelope tucked under the gate. No stamp. No return address. Just my name, written in Ethan's handwriting. My first instinct was to throw it away. Instead, I opened it. The letter inside was short. "Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know everything I did because I didn't know how to be anything else. I'm not asking for sympathy. Just remember me as I was, not as I am." I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. Not then. But that night alone in my bedroom, I lay awake thinking about the boy he once was. The boy who used to run down the hill in the rain, just to meet me at the school gates. The boy who saved half his Halloween candy for me because I liked the chocolate ones. And I realized something loving him didn't mean I had to let him hurt me. That was the difference between the woman I had been and the woman I was now. I could carry the memory of who he had been without sacrificing the person I needed to be to survive. And maybe in its own way that was a kind of forgiveness, one that didn't excuse, but also didn't consume. The town's gossip eventually found someone else to chew on, and Ethan's name faded from daily conversation. But the lessons he'd left me with stayed sharp. I kept the letter. Not because I wanted to revisit the pain, but because I wanted to remember the cost of ignoring my own boundaries. It sat in the top drawer of my desk next to my will, and the deed to the house, two things that would never again be in jeopardy as long as I lived. And on quiet mornings when the sun rose just right and the house was filled with golden light, I would brew my tea, sit by the window, and remind myself I had faced the worst storm a mother could face, and I was still here. Not just alive, but whole. The ambulance's siren wailed in the distance, slicing through the heavy silence that had settled over the rocky cliffs. My body trembled, but not from the chill of the wind or the wet clothes clinging to my skin. It was from the flood of adrenaline still surging through my veins, the kind that comes when you've stared death in the face and realized you weren't ready to bow out yet. I glanced down at my hands, still raw and scraped from clawing my way back onto the ledge after the fall. Salt water dripped from my hair into my eyes, stinging. But the sting was nothing compared to the deeper ache in my chest, not the one from my heart condition, but the one from the truth that I could no longer deny. My son had meant to hurt me, not frighten me, not teach me some twisted lesson in bravery like he'd claimed before shoving me, but truly hurt me. And now, sitting there on the hard stone, I realized something chilling. The moment I hit that water, I'd stopped being his mother in his eyes. I had become an obstacle, an inconvenience, something to get rid of. The paramedics finally arrived, kneeling beside me with blankets assessing me for fractures, or worse. One of them asked, "Did you fall accidentally, ma'am?" I opened my mouth, but my gaze shifted toward the group standing near the cliff edge. My son Daniel was there. His arms folded, his face pale. He didn't rush to me, didn't kneel beside me, didn't even try to look concerned. He just watched, jaw tight, as if waiting to see what I would say. It hit me. Then this wasn't just about the shove. It was about power. "Yes," I said slowly, my voice hoarse. "I fell." The paramedics nodded, jotting something down, and began guiding me toward the waiting ambulance. Daniel's eyes flickered, and for the briefest second I saw a smirk tug at the corner of his lips. Not of joy, but of relief. I had given him the cover he needed, but what he didn't know was that I wasn't protecting him out of fear. I was protecting my revenge. At the hospital, the tests confirmed no broken bones, but my cardiologist wasn't happy. "You were incredibly lucky," Dr. Patel said, looking over my chart. "Your heart could have gone into arrhythmia from the shock alone. You need rest and no stress." No stress. If only he knew. Daniel visited that evening. He brought flowers, daisies my least favorite, and set them on the table with the kind of mechanical politeness one uses for a stranger. "You scared me, Mom," he said. "I thought I'd lost you." I studied his face. The words were perfect, but the eyes, they were cold, calculating. "Is that so?" I replied softly. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before plastering on a smile. "Of course. I don't know what I'd do without you." I almost laughed. Because I knew exactly what he'd do without me: sell the house, take whatever insurance money he could, and run off with the same woman who had whispered poison into his ear for months. But I didn't say it. Not yet. When I was discharged 2 days later, Daniel insisted on driving me home. He talked the whole way about how I should take up some hobbies, maybe do some traveling, maybe even move somewhere warmer, all under the guise of caring for my health. But underneath it, I heard the push leave the house. Leave him in control. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd. There was a stack of mail on the porch, even though I'd been gone only 3 days. I picked it up and flipped through. Most were bills or junk, but one thick envelope caught my eye. It was addressed to Daniel, but the return address was from a real estate agency. I slid it into my sweater pocket before he could notice. That night, after he'd gone home, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and opened the envelope. Inside were copies of listings, property valuations, and a draft contract for my house. My hands shook, but my mind was sharp. This was the proof I needed. He wasn't just thinking about taking over, he was already making the moves. And the timing. The cliff incident suddenly looked like step one in a larger plan. I realized I couldn't confront him yet. If I did, he'd just bury the evidence or spin the story, so I looked unstable. No, I had to play the long game. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Mr. Greer. He'd handled my late husband's estate and knew the family history well. "I need to make some changes to my will," I told him, "and I need it airtight." He didn't ask questions, just set an appointment. I also began making other, quieter moves. I contacted a friend who worked at the local paper and asked if she could recommend a good investigative journalist. I told her it was about family financial disputes, which was the polite way of saying my own son tried to murder me for property. 2 weeks passed. Daniel's visits became more frequent but not warmer. He'd bring me groceries I hadn't asked for, try to suggest contractors to fix the place up for resale, and drop hints about how living alone isn't safe for someone in your condition. I played along, nodding, thanking him, pretending to be the docile, fragile mother he wanted me to be. Inside, I was documenting every word. I even let him think he was winning. I let him bring over his girlfriend Olivia, the one with the glossy hair and shark eyes. She'd look around the house like she was mentally redecorating it, running her hand along the banister as if testing its quality. "Oh, this place has good bones," she said once. "Just needs a bit of modernizing." Daniel smirked. "Mom's old-fashioned. She doesn't like change." I smiled sweetly. Change isn't always bad. Sometimes it just needs the right timing. Neither of them caught the double meaning. The turning point came when I overheard a phone call. Daniel had stepped outside to take a work call, but I'd followed quietly to the side porch. His voice was low but clear. "No, she's not going to last much longer," he said. "Her heart's weak. One good scare and, well, then we can move forward." My breath caught. There it was, the real him stripped of all pretense. I stepped back inside before he could see me. My hands were cold, but my resolve was white hot. This wasn't just greed. This was premeditation. And that meant I could do more than protect myself. I could make sure he'd never try this with anyone else. By the time I met with the journalist, I had a neat little file, the real estate documents, a written log of conversations, and even a discreet recording of that phone call. She listened, her eyes widening with each piece of evidence I slid across the table. "This is intense," she said. "Are you sure you want to go public?" I thought about it. My whole life I'd avoided scandal. I'd kept the family's messes behind closed doors. But those days were over. "Yes," I said firmly, "but not yet. I want him to see it coming. I want him to feel it closing in." The trap was almost ready. I changed my will to leave the house to a local charity, bypassing Daniel entirely. I moved a portion of my savings into a trust he couldn't touch. And I let slip through a mutual acquaintance that I'd been talking to estate buyers about selling the house myself. The bait worked. Within a week, Daniel came over in a panic, urging me to reconsider. "You're making a mistake, Mom," he said, pacing the living room. "This house should stay in the family." I tilted my head. Which family? The one that pushes me off cliffs, or the one that visits me in the hospital? His mouth opened, then shut. He didn't know what to say. Good. That meant the next move was mine. My body trembled, not from the wind that whipped across the cliff's edge, but from the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The place where it had all started, the spot from which I had been pushed, now became the stage for my final act. I stood there staring at the waves crashing below, their thunder mingling with the pounding of my heart. Beside me, my son, the same boy who had told me he just wanted to make me braver before shoving me off that ledge, now stood silent, pale, and cornered. His eyes darted from me to the path behind us as if calculating an escape. But there was none. Not now. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The calm in my tone seemed to unsettle him more than any shouting could. "Do you remember your exact words, Jacob?" I asked, turning my gaze back to the ocean. Mom, I told you I was just... No." The exact words I pressed. His jaw clenched. "I just wanted to help you be braver." There it was. The same twisted reasoning he'd used that day, the same justification that had nearly cost me my life. I took a slow step toward him. "You wanted me to be braver by almost killing me? Or was it about control? About seeing how much you could break me and still have me crawl back to you?" His lips parted, but no sound came. His shoulders sagged. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small black recorder. His eyes widened. "You've been recording every word I said evenly. From the first conversation we had after I came home from the hospital to today." His voice cracked. "Mom, you can't, I can. I interrupted, my tone sharper now. And I will. The police will hear it. The court will hear it. Everyone who needs to know the truth will hear it. He shook his head, stepping back. This will ruin me. I looked at him for a long, steady moment. So you finally understand what it feels like to be ruined. The weeks that followed were a blur of police interviews, lawyer meetings, and courtroom appearances. My son, my own flesh and blood, was charged with attempted manslaughter. His defense team tried to spin the story into an accident, claiming he'd been playing or trying to help me conquer a fear of heights. But the recording, coupled with my testimony and the doctor's statements about my heart condition, stripped that argument bare. I sat through every hearing, every motion, every tear-filled plea from his side of the family. His father, my ex-husband, showed up once, glaring at me as though I were the villain. But I didn't flinch. I had learned that justice doesn't come from appeasing guilt. It comes from refusing to bow to it. The trial stretched over 2 months, and on the final day, as the jury foreman read guilty, I didn't cheer or cry. I simply closed my eyes and breathed. Yet the legal victory was not the end. Far from it. The harder part came afterward, the silence. I returned to my home, the same home I had once hoped my son would inherit, and sat in the kitchen at night with the hum of the refrigerator as my only companion. Friends called. Neighbors offered sympathy. Some praised my strength. Others whispered that I had gone too far. But in the quiet, I replayed everything: his laugh the day he pushed me, the look on his face as I gasped for breath in the water, the way he tried to minimize it afterward. I realized something painful. I had not only lost my son, I had lost the illusion that love from a child is unconditional. One evening, months later, I received a letter from him. The handwriting was rushed, jagged. Mom, I hate you for what you did to me, but I also hate myself for what I did to you. I don't know which part will eat me alive first. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I can't stop seeing your face when I turned around and realized you weren't surfacing. I stared at the words, feeling neither satisfaction nor pity, only a dull ache. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I didn't want to throw it away. Some wounds are too deep to burn, even when you want to. Life has a strange way of moving forward even when part of you is still standing on that cliff. I took up gardening again. I joined a local reading group. I traveled to the coast, not the one where the incident happened, but another far away, and stood by the shore. The sea was calmer there, the wind softer. And for the first time, I let the ocean sound wash over me without feeling the weight of fear pressing in. If you're listening to this story now, wondering whether I regret sending my son to prison, here is my truth. I regret the need for it, but not the act itself. Forgiveness without accountability is just permission for the same harm to happen again. He taught me something that day, not bravery in the way he meant, but the courage to survive betrayal from the one person you never imagined would harm you. And in surviving, I found a kind of freedom I didn't know I was searching for. To anyone who's been hurt by someone you love, you do not owe them your silence. You do not owe them your protection at the expense of your own life. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk into the storm and speak, even if your voice shakes. If my story has found you at a moment when you feel small, unseen, or trapped by someone else's cruelty, let it be proof that you can choose yourself. And you can do it without apology, because your life is not theirs to gamble with. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you've ever had an experience where someone you trusted betrayed you in a way you never thought possible, I invite you to share your story in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories of truth survival and the kind of revenge that is rooted in self-respect, subscribe to Grace's Truth. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't about making them fall. It's about making sure they never have the chance to push you again.